There was a cafe I used to sit at in Dubai Marina, one of those places where the espresso cost $12 and the skyline made you forget that the entire economic miracle around you was built on a narrow stretch of water called the Strait of Hormuz. You could see the Burj Al Arab from there, glinting like a monument to the idea that money, if you have enough of it, can buy you immunity from history. The waiters were Pakistani, the baristas were Ethiopian, the manager was Lebanese, and the customers were scrolling through property listings on their phones, placing bets on a future that assumed the Gulf would remain calm forever. That assumption just died. On the morning of March 24, 2026, the Wall Street Journal dropped a report that landed in geopolitical circles like a delayed fuse bomb. Saudi Arabia had granted the United States military access to King Fahd Air Base, located in the mountainous Hejaz region near Taif, roughly 1,200 kilometers from the Iranian border. The UAE, meanwhile, had shut down the Iranian hospital and the Iranian club in Dubai, closed Iranian-linked schools, and was actively debating whether to freeze billions of dollars in Iranian assets held within the Emirates. Both nations, the two pillars of Gulf financial power, were inching toward active participation in the war against Iran. Let that land for a second. The countries that spent the better part of a decade building themselves as the Switzerland of the Middle East, neutral zones of capital, tourism, and ambition, were now preparing to cross a line that cannot be uncrossed. And this is the story nobody in the mainstream was telling properly. Not the war itself, you could get that from any ticker. But the deeper question, what happens to the entire architecture of Gulf power when the kingdoms that built their legitimacy on stability decide to embrace destruction? Let me walk you through it. To understand what happened this week, you have to understand what the Gulf monarchies actually are. Not what they look like on Instagram, the glass towers, the artificial islands, the indoor ski slopes in the desert, but what they are in the grammar of global power. They are nodes, financial nodes, energy nodes, logistics nodes. Dubai is not a city in the way London or Tokyo are cities. Dubai is a platform where Iranian businessmen park money, Russian oligarchs buy apartments, Indian traders move gold, and Chinese firms build the infrastructure that makes it all possible. Abu Dhabi, next door, is the sovereign wealth engine, quiet, deliberate, and sitting on some of the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. Saudi Arabia is the heavyweight, the kingdom that sets the rhythm of global oil markets, the custodian of Mecca and Medina, the anchor of OPEC, and the country that made a deal with Washington in the 1970s that created the petrodollar system. Saudi oil priced in American dollars, American security guarantees in return, the invisible architecture of the post-Bretton Woods world. But here is the part most analysts skip over. That deal was always a transaction, not a marriage. And transactions can be renegotiated. For the past 5 years, Riyadh had been quietly diversifying. Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, was building NEOM, courting Chinese investment, joining BRICS dialogues, normalizing relations with Iran through a Beijing-brokered agreement in 2023. The kingdom was hedging, playing all sides, staying out of direct confrontation. When the Iran war started on February 28th, the Saudis said clearly, "Our bases cannot be used for attacks on Iran." 3.5 weeks later, they reversed that position. King Fahd Air Base is now open to American jets. What changed? The answer is not ideology. It is not some sudden realization that Iran is an existential threat. The answer is simpler and more brutal. Iranian missiles started hitting Saudi territory, and the kingdom's entire economic model, Vision 2030, the tourism boom, the tech investment pipeline, was suddenly exposed as fragile. The Sheba oil field, deep in the Rub al Khali desert, came under drone attack. Eastern Province, the heartland of Saudi petroleum production, was targeted. Riyadh itself was within range. The interceptors worked mostly, but the psychological damage was done. Now here is the most surprising part of this entire saga, and it is something almost nobody was talking about. The real trigger for Saudi Arabia's shift was not the missiles that hit. It was the missiles that were intercepted, because every Patriot battery that fires costs money. Every interception burns through ammunition that takes months to replace. And every night that Saudi air defenses light up the sky over Riyadh is a night that international investors recalculate their risk models. The kingdom discovered what Israel learned years ago. Iron Dome economics are punishing. You can win every engagement and still lose the war of attrition if the other side has enough cheap drones to keep you firing. The Saudi Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan put it on the record last week in terms that diplomats rarely use in public. He said that Saudi Arabia's patience with Iranian attacks was not unlimited. One source told the journal it was only a matter of time before the kingdom entered the war. Another source described MBS as eager to re-establish deterrence. Re-establish deterrence. That phrase is the key, because deterrence in the Gulf context was never really about military hardware. It was about the perception of invulnerability. Dubai's brand in the gleaming city where nothing bad happens, where the future is always under construction, where the worst thing that can go wrong is a flight delay, was shattered the moment debris from an intercepted Iranian drone fell near the Burj Al Arab, when shrapnel damaged buildings on Palm Jumeirah, when a fuel tank at Dubai International Airport caught fire after a drone strike and flights were suspended, when videos circulated of expats fleeing on private jets that cost $250,000 per seat, when pets, hundreds of pets, were abandoned in the streets of Dubai by owners who decided that their French bulldog was not worth dying for. That image, the abandoned dogs of Dubai, will do more long-term damage to the Gulf's economic brand than any missile strike, because the brand was built on the promise of safety, and safety, once lost, does not return on a marketing budget. The UAE's response has been multi-layered, and this is where the analysis gets genuinely interesting. Abu Dhabi is not simply considering whether to deploy F-16 Block 60 Desert Falcons against Iranian targets. That is the kinetic question, and it is almost secondary. The real power move is financial. Think about it. The UAE has been for decades a financial lifeline for Iran. Despite sanctions, despite diplomatic tensions, Iranian money flowed through Dubai's banks, Iranian businesses operated through Emirati free zones, and Iranian gold traders used Dubai's souk as a clearinghouse. The Iranian hospital in Dubai was not just a hospital, it was an institutional anchor, a physical presence that said, "We are here, we are embedded, and you cannot remove us without cost." The UAE just removed them, and it is now debating whether to freeze billions, with a B, in Iranian assets. If that happens, it would be one of the most consequential financial warfare moves since the West froze Russian central bank reserves in 2022. Except this time, it would be coming from a country that was supposed to be neutral, a country that Iran considered, if not friendly, at least transactional. The message from Abu Dhabi is clear. If you bomb our cities, we will cut your money. And in the Gulf, money is the real weapon. But here is the thing nobody in Washington seems to be gaming out properly. If the UAE freezes Iranian assets, Tehran has nothing left to lose in the Gulf. The entire rationale for Iranian restraint toward the Emirates, the idea that Dubai's financial system was too useful to destroy, evaporates the moment those assets are frozen. At that point, Iran's calculus becomes purely military. Hit everything, everywhere, as hard as you can, because the economic incentive for restraint is gone. This is what I call the paradox of financial warfare. You impose costs on your enemy, but in doing so, you remove the very leverage that was keeping them from escalating further. The same logic applied when the West froze Russian reserves after the Ukraine invasion. It made Moscow more aggressive, not less, because the threat of future sanctions had already been spent. Now, zoom out. Because the Gulf is not an island. It is the hinge of the global economy, and what happens there ripples outward in ways that most people do not fully grasp until they see it at the grocery store or the gas pump. The Strait of Hormuz, that 21-mile wide bottleneck between Iran and Oman, normally carries about 20 million barrels of oil per day. That is roughly 20% of all seaborne oil trade on the planet. It also carries a significant share of global liquefied natural gas, fertilizer raw materials, aluminum, and steel. When the IRGC effectively closed the strait in the first days of March, it triggered the largest energy supply disruption since the 1973 oil crisis. Brent crude surged past $100, then past $114, briefly touching $126 at its peak. The International Energy Agency, not exactly an institution given to hyperbole, called it worse than the two oil shocks of the 1970s and the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war on gas combined. The IEA agreed to release 400 million barrels of oil from emergency stockpiles, 172 million from the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve alone. Saudi Arabia activated its east-west pipeline to divert oil from the eastern fields to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. The UAE tried to route crude through the Abu Dhabi pipeline to Fujairah on the Arabian seaside, but then drones hit Fujairah too. And this is where the truly alarming detail sits, the one that nobody wanted to say out loud on cable news. The closure of Hormuz was not a temporary disruption. It was a demonstration that the entire global energy architecture, built over decades on the assumption that this narrow waterway would always remain open, was a single point of failure. One country with enough missiles and drones and willingness to absorb punishment could shut down the oxygen supply of the world economy, and no amount of carrier strike groups in the Arabian Sea could guarantee that supply would resume on schedule. The Dallas Federal Reserve modeled a scenario where Hormuz stays closed for one full quarter, WTI averaging $98, global GDP growth dropping by nearly 3 annualized percentage points in Q2. Goldman Sachs warned that if disruption lasted 10 weeks, Brent would likely exceed its 2008 record. Asia was hit hardest. China, India, Japan, and South Korea account for nearly 70% of Gulf oil shipments. India scrambled for emergency waivers to buy stranded Russian cargoes. Japan and South Korea activated conservation mandates. New Zealand announced emergency payments to working families struggling with fuel costs. This is what Pepe always calls the Mackinder moment, the point where geography reasserts itself over finance. You can build all the digital economies you want, you can talk about AI and blockchain and the metaverse until the lights go out, but at the end of the day, civilizations run on energy, and energy runs through physical choke points that have not moved since the Sumerians first sailed the Gulf. Now, let me bring you to the most fascinating chess move on the board, and it is one that almost nobody in the Western press was covering with the depth it deserved. While the Gulf states were deciding whether to enter the war, and while Trump was posting all-caps declarations of very good and productive conversations on Truth Social, and while Iran was flatly denying that any talks had taken place, something far more consequential was happening in the electromagnetic spectrum. Russia was feeding Iran real-time intelligence on U.S. warship and aircraft positions across the Middle East, not vague satellite imagery, precise, actionable coordinates, the kind that allow an Iranian ballistic missile to thread through carrier strike group air defenses and hit targets that should have been untouchable. The Washington Post confirmed the pipeline. 3 senior American officials went on record. Russia's Canopus V reconnaissance satellite, transferred to Iranian operational use under the name Kayam, was providing Tehran with round-the-clock optical and radar imagery of American military assets. China, meanwhile, had been supplying radar systems, navigation tools, and spare parts for Iranian missile systems, a supply chain that had been building quietly for years under the umbrella of the 25-year cooperation agreement signed in 2021. Chinese hardware was embedded in Iranian air defense networks. When the IRGC claimed it had destroyed 10 advanced U.S. radar systems across the region, a claim that, if even partially true, would explain how Iranian missiles were reaching targets in Israel and the Gulf, the technology enabling those strikes had Chinese fingerprints on it. And yet, neither Russia nor China committed a single soldier. No warships, no air cover, no direct military intervention. They condemned the U.S.-Israeli strikes at the UN. They requested emergency Security Council sessions. They abstained from the resolution condemning Iranian attacks on Gulf states. And they continued supplying the tools that kept Iran in the fight, all while maintaining plausible deniability. This is the architecture of the multipolar moment, not a grand alliance against America, not a formal axis, something far more flexible and dangerous, a distributed support network where each partner contributes what it can afford. Russia provides eyes, China provides components, and Iran provides the willingness to absorb punishment and keep firing. It does not have a name yet, but anyone paying attention can see it taking shape. The U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, when asked directly about Russian intelligence assistance on 60 Minutes, answered with exactly 4 words that should keep every strategic planner in Washington awake at night. He said, "We're tracking everything." That is either a reassurance or a warning, possibly both. And now we arrive at the most schizophrenic moment in the entire crisis, the moment that perfectly encapsulated the chaos of the current world order. On Saturday, March 26, Trump gave Iran a 48-hour ultimatum to reopen the Strait of Hormuz or face strikes on its power plants. On Sunday, messages started flowing through Turkey, Egypt, and Pakistan, three mediating countries trying to arrange a call between Trump's envoys and the Speaker of the Iranian parliament, Ghalibaf. On Monday morning, Trump posted in all caps that the talks had been very good and productive. Oil cratered. The S&P 500 surged 1.7 trillion, and then Iran denied any talks had happened. Ghalibaf called it fake news, designed to manipulate financial markets. The markets swung wildly. Brent crude went from 114 to 99 in hours, then climbed back above 100 the next day. Fortune magazine coined a term for it. TACO. Trump announces, chaos occurs. Darkly funny, except the chaos was not abstract. It was measured in the price of bread in Cairo, the cost of diesel in Dhaka, the heating bill of a pensioner in Prague. This is the world we are living in now. A world where a social media post can move $1.7 trillion before breakfast, and where the denial of that post can claw back half of it by lunch. A world where the difference between war and peace depends on whether a phone call between a real estate developer and a parliamentary speaker actually took place, or was merely inferred from second-hand messages passed through three intermediary governments. And all of this was happening while the Gulf monarchies were making their calculation. Because here is what Riyadh and Abu Dhabi understood. The American commitment to their security was conditional. Trump had shown, with the Ukraine talks, the Venezuela incursion, the Nigeria operations, that his approach to force was transactional. He would use it when it served his interests and walk away when it did not. The 5-day pause on strikes against Iranian energy infrastructure was not a peace gesture. It was a market intervention. Trump needed oil prices down before they triggered a domestic political crisis. The war was secondary to the Dow. The fourth Gulf official, quoted by the Times of Israel, put it with remarkable candor. The inadequate American planning for Iran's retaliation would lead his country to diversify its security partners in the future, rather than overly relying on the U.S. Read that sentence again. A Gulf state, in the middle of a war where American jets are flying from its bases, is already planning for the post-American security order. That is not ingratitude. That is strategic realism of the coldest kind. And so the Gulf monarchies face a decision that goes far beyond this particular war. It is a decision about what kind of states they want to be in the 21st century. The model they built, wealth without military risk, global integration without geopolitical commitment, neutrality as a business strategy, worked beautifully for 3 decades. It worked because the American security umbrella was reliable, because Iran was contained, because oil flowed freely, and because nobody seriously challenged the assumption that the Gulf's glass towers were untouchable. Every single one of those assumptions collapsed in the last 25 days. The war revealed something that should have been obvious but was conveniently ignored. The Gulf states are geographically trapped. They sit within range of Iranian missiles. Their economies depend on a single maritime choke point that Iran can close. Their populations are overwhelmingly expatriate, workers who will leave at the first sign of sustained danger. Their militaries, while well-equipped, have limited combat experience, and their social contracts, no taxes, generous subsidies, endless construction projects, depend on oil revenue that is currently being disrupted by the very conflict they are being asked to join. Entering the war against Iran solves one problem. It degrades Iranian military capability, at least temporarily, but creates a dozen others. It makes the Gulf states permanent enemies of Tehran. It ties them irrevocably to American and Israeli strategic objectives. It exposes their infrastructure to escalated attacks, and it destroys the narrative of neutrality that made them attractive to investors, tourists, and workers from every corner of the world. The most chilling assessment came from a Gulf official quoted in the Times of Israel. When asked what the war's objective should be, the official said he wanted it to continue until Iran's missile and drone manufacturing capacity was destroyed. He acknowledged that Iran would retain the knowledge to rebuild, but insisted that generational damage would be sufficient. Generational damage. That is the phrase that should make everyone stop and think, because generational damage is a two-way street. If the Gulf enters this war and Iran retaliates with everything it has, not the calibrated strikes we have seen so far, but a full unleashing of its arsenal, the generational damage will not be confined to Iranian factories. It will be measured in the ruins of Dubai Marina, in the fires at Jebel Ali port, in the refugee columns heading south through Oman, in the collapse of property values that will wipe out the savings of millions of expatriate workers who bet their futures on the Gulf miracle. The abandoned dogs of Dubai are a metaphor, but they are also a warning. And then there is the question that sits beneath all of this like a fault line beneath a city. The question that none of the Gulf's rulers want to answer, because the answer terrifies them. What if the war ends and Iran survives? What if, despite the strikes, despite the assassinations, despite the economic warfare, Tehran reconstitutes its capabilities? What if the regime changes but the strategic calculus does not? What if the next Iranian government, whoever it is, remembers which neighbors opened their airspace, hosted American bombers, and froze Iranian money? History is long in the Middle East. The Iranians have been a civilization for 3,000 years. They survived Alexander, the Mongols, Saddam's chemical weapons, and 8 years of war. The Gulf monarchies, for all their wealth, are modern constructs, most younger than the average American strip mall. Their legitimacy rests on delivery, not on deep historical identity. When the money stops flowing, the contracts that hold these societies together become negotiable. Nobody was modeling that scenario. Nobody was wargaming what happens to the UAE's economy if the war lasts 3 months and the expatriate workforce, roughly 88% of the population, decides it is time to go home. The Hormuz crisis is not just an energy story. It is not just a military story. It is a story about the fragility of systems that appear invulnerable until the moment they are not. It is a story about how the architecture of global trade, the tanker routes, the insurance markets, the pipeline infrastructure, the naval escort doctrines, was built on assumptions that have just been stress tested to failure. And at the center of it all, the burning hourglass. The sand is running out on the Gulf's old model. The glass towers still stand for now, but the foundation beneath them is cracking. The monarchies are being forced to choose, remain neutral and accept permanent vulnerability to Iranian coercion, or enter the war and accept the destruction of everything they spent 50 years building. There is no good option. There is only the least catastrophic one. And nobody, not Riyadh, not Abu Dhabi, not Washington, and certainly not Tehran, seems confident they know which one that is. The real war is not the missiles and drones lighting up the Gulf sky every night. The real war is the one being fought in the spreadsheets of sovereign wealth funds, in the risk models of insurance underwriters, in the departure lounges of Dubai International Airport where expatriate families are deciding whether to stay or go. Because empires do not fall to armies. They fall to accountants. They fall when the numbers stop adding up. And in the Gulf, the numbers are changing faster than anyone wants to admit. I started this in a Dubai cafe. Let me end it with a question that the man at the next table, the one scrolling through property listings on his phone, would have laughed at a month ago but is now asking himself every single morning. The question is this: what is a city worth when the people who built it no longer believe it will be there tomorrow? That is the question the Gulf is facing right now. And the answer, whatever it turns out to be, they will reshape the Middle East, the global energy order, and the meaning of security itself for generations to come. The hourglass is burning. The sand is almost gone. And the only thing certain is that when it runs out, nothing will look the same. Stay sharp. Stay curious. The game is far from over.